Welcome to the 8th episode of A Change is a Chance. By interviewing different experts, I hope that I am educating listeners, especially young listeners like me, on the issues in the world. The presidential election is coming up and the discussions are intensifying after both conventions have ended. Sadly, I cannot vote, but I am happy that there are hundreds of millions of people who can and are. But there are also millions of people who aren't voting, and that has to be fixed. Now, please allow me to proudly introduce my 8th guest. Electing a president is a really big deal, so this country needs everyone to vote. But voter suppression and apathy get in the way of that. Why does this happen, and what can we do to stop this from happening? My guest, Mr. Josh Greenbaum, is here to talk to us about the U.S. Vote Foundation and its role in getting people to vote. He will also help us break down the reasons behind voter apathy and suppression. Mr. Greenbaum is the founder and principal of Enterprise Application Consulting and the Chief Tech Officer of the U.S. Vote Foundation. Hello, Mr. Greenbaum. Thank you for joining us. How are you doing today?
I'm great, Ryan. Thanks. Thanks for inviting me on your show. I'm really looking forward to it.
The election is in 60 days, and I'm sure the U.S. Vote Foundation must be very busy.
Oh my goodness, we are really busy. And what's exciting is that we're getting a tremendous amount of interest from lots of new voters and voters who are really trying to figure out how to cast a ballot in this complicated pandemic era. So there's a lot of activity going on.
Well, building off of that, let's start there. What is the ultimate goal of the U.S. Vote Foundation?
So our motto is very simple. Every citizen is a voter. And when we say every citizen, we really mean it. There are, you probably have done this research. There's a couple 100 million people who are eligible to vote in this country. We want to make sure every one of them votes. I think personally, our democracy is strongest when we have the greatest participation, when we have the most diverse number of people voting from all walks of life, and that's our goal. Make it easy for them to vote.
You guys are really doing a lot to help get the vote out. But what about you? How did you get involved?
So it's sort of an interesting story. The founder of U.S. Vote Foundation is actually an old friend of mine, and we met when I was based in Paris 20 some years ago. And that was at a time she actually founded the first part of the U.S. Vote Foundation, which was Overseas Vote Foundation. She was living in Europe. I was actually living in Europe. And Susan, our founder, found that it was very, very difficult to find information about voting. If you went to your embassy, they gave you a booklet that made no sense. A lot of local election officials didn't want to help overseas voters. So Susan created the first online database of voting information. Where to go to vote, how to get your ballot, what are the dates and deadlines. So that was the background about 16 years ago. After the 2016 election, I decided I was going to start getting involved. I wanted to be more proactive. My parents, my family were very politically active growing up in the 60s and 70s. My parents marched for civil rights. In the 60s, they were involved with the anti-Vietnam War era. They were involved with disability rights. And I thought maybe it was my time to start paying back society a little bit. What I like about U.S. Vote Foundation is that we're nonpartisan. This is really important. We don't really care who you vote for. We don't care if you're a Republican, a Democrat, Green Party. You can be anything you want. We just want people to vote. And I really like that part of it because I think it's important, most of all, that everyone is involved. So I contacted Susan right after the election in 2016 and said, how can I help? And she said, come on board. And so I've been working as a volunteer for the foundation ever since. And it's been quite an interesting ride.
That's very admirable that you decided to do something.
Thank you.
I learned that the 2016 presidential election tilted to Donald Trump with fewer than 80,000 votes across 3 states. Yet only about 6 in 10 eligible voters cast their ballots in 2016. That was really shocking to hear. What do you think are the root causes of voter apathy?
Wow, it's an interesting and complicated question, Ryan, and a lot of people smarter than me have really tried to figure this out. You're absolutely right. We have 230 million people approximately who are eligible to vote. And I think about 100 million of them didn't in 2016. Most importantly, I mean, you mentioned those 3 states. One of those states was my home state, Michigan. Michigan, the total vote between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton was decided by 10,000 voters, 10,000 votes. 1 million Michigan voters were already registered. They were registered. They just had to go to the poll. They didn't vote. That to me is sort of mind-boggling. Why don't people vote? Well, apathy is complicated. First of all, there are a lot of barriers, and I know we're going to talk about various barriers to voting. It's hard sometimes to vote. Voting is complicated. It's very simple to say I want to vote for one side or the other, for president or even Senate. When you start looking at a ballot, when you get down to the local issues, in California, we vote for initiatives and referendums. Our ballots can be 3 pages long and extremely complicated. It's hard to follow. So that's one reason people don't vote. The other is, we don't really make it easy. We don't, it's not a national holiday. You have to do it during work hours. A lot of states, California is not one of them, luckily, really restrict how to get an absentee ballot. So, there's a lot of reasons why, and I think finally, and this is a little more complicated, when I grew up, politics wasn't so polarized. There was a way for I remember, when this is 100 years ago, I'm joking, but when John Kennedy and Barry Goldwater were going to run for president against each other, they had an idea that maybe they would just travel the country together and debate each other at every stop. Even though they were on complete opposite sides of so many issues, they understood the need to be together and to present democracy in this fashion. Today, politics are very polarized, and frankly, it's a little embarrassing. I'm sure your parents are struggling sometimes to explain why all these adults are frankly just misbehaving. There's no other word for it. So I think a lot of people are discouraged. A lot of people find the polarization is nasty, and it's a nasty business, and they don't want to have anything to do with it, unfortunately.
Thank you so much for informing us on this. Half of that I didn't know.
Okay.
I recently found out that poor, young, Hispanic, or Asian Americans are more likely to be non-voters. Why do you think that these groups in particular don't vote?
Well, that's again, very interesting question, because a lot of people try to study it. I'll tell you, one of the problems with studying voting is people don't like to tell researchers who they voted for or how they voted. And we find that you study a bunch of people and you say, how did you vote? And you add it up and the percentages are wrong. They actually sometimes don't tell the truth. So it's hard to study this. But there are some things that we know about why people don't vote. And in particular, recent immigrant groups who come to this country from societies that aren't democratic or don't have a strong democratic tradition, don't themselves have that tradition. They're not used to voting. Their parents didn't vote. Their grandparents didn't vote. It's very different than me growing up here with parents who are very politically active and a lot of other people. So this is particularly true with Hispanic voters who are coming from Central America and South America, where democracy has been a complicated thing. Same thing with some of the Asian American voters we have. I think poverty is a separate issue with respect to voting. There are a lot of, if you're poor, if you're working class, if you're struggling to raise a family, you're a single mom with a bunch of kids, and you want to vote, well, again, if you can't get an absentee ballot, and you gotta take a day off or take time off from work or try to get to the polls before work in time to vote, or get there after work before they close. And these barriers accumulate. Maybe you don't have a car. How do you get to the polling place? It may not be close enough to your work or your home. So the things that are barriers to people who aren't poor, middle class and above, become extraordinarily big barriers for poor people. So there's a lot of that, and frankly, and we're going to talk about this, I know, voter suppression. a lot of people are afraid to let poor people vote, and they make it difficult for them to do. And we'll talk about that, I think, a little bit in a minute.
I find that very important. It's something for me to think about all the time. Older Americans tend to vote more than youth for up to 30%. Why do you think this is? And how can we get the younger generation to care more? I know I can't wait to vote.
And I can't wait for you to vote either. I think that's wonderful that you have this perspective. I think, as I was saying this before, I mean, people in my generation grew up in a time when voting was a very different story and politics were a very different story. And I think we weren't, how should we say, we weren't as put off by the national dialogue. It was slightly more, more civil, more polite. Politicians were nicer to each other, to be honest. I think young people growing up today are, again, since, it's been the last 20 years, the national politics have become pretty ugly. And that ugliness turns a lot of young people off. And I think rightly so. It's a little embarrassing, as someone who is, in the boomer generation, to sort of look at where the politics have gone in my lifetime and think, well, come on, young people, get going anyway, even though it's gotten uglier, it's gotten in some ways worse, not better, you still should vote. So I think that's a reason. But let me tell you, your question of how to get young people to vote is something I think about a lot. And what I really encourage young people to do is don't think about voting as just voting for president. In fact, try not to think about that. Look at what you're really voting for. If you live in your community or my community or anyone's community, you're voting for things that frankly are much more important on a daily basis. You're voting for how do you fund the schools? How do you care for the health of the citizens around you? How do you fund the police? How do you fund and take care of the parks? How do you have a lovely and beautiful place for you as young people to grow up, me as a parent to raise my children? These are issues that are not partisan. This isn't about Democrats versus Republicans. It's really something, the local issues about how do we have a better community for all of us are something that I think everybody can agree on. If you look at, in many communities, the votes you make for local issues are not even about Democrats versus Republicans. They're not even sponsored by the Democratic or the Republican or any other party. They're local issues. And I think I think young people should really look around and say, let's try to figure out what does the voting really mean in my local community first. And I think if you look around and you say voting is important for my local community, you're going to be more interested in voting. I think one of the things about the Black Lives Matter movement that happened this spring is that people are now, and it's a complicated debate, we're not going to get into it today, but people really want to change how policing is done in their communities. Well, guess what? You don't elect a national head of police chief. We're not that kind of country. Some countries have that. We don't. Policing is local. You want to change the relationship between your police force and your citizenry local. Whether you want to give them more money, change their jobs, do anything, give them more resources, give them different resources. That's local. You got to vote local to make that change. And if you frankly want to make a change and you're not voting local, in my opinion, you got to really think about why you're complaining, but you're not willing to do something about it.
I couldn't agree with you more, and I can't wait to share my voice.
Great.
Now, let's talk a bit more about voter suppression. It is a complicated topic, but one that I don't think is discussed enough. When I was doing research recently, I learned that the purge rate is as much as 40% higher in states that have a known history of racial discrimination. What is the connection between these two? Additionally, over 10% of precincts in the U.S. were closed between 2008 and 2016. The impacts of this affected communities of colors hardest. Why were these communities affected most?
Another wonderful question, and it's unfortunate that Senator Cory Booker once said, if you if being an American citizen isn't equally a wonderful thing and a heartbreaking thing, if America hasn't broken your heart, then you don't love her enough. And the story of voting is a story of one of the things we didn't get right and still haven't gotten right. Actually, you know, at the founding of the country, the rule really was exclusion, not inclusion. So, you know, when the colonies became the first 13 states, you had to be a white landowner, a rich man, to vote. End of story. Slowly but surely, though, you could then, the voting was opened up little by little by little to include other white men. But that was kind of it for a long, long time. The Emancipation Proclamation that freed the slaves theoretically freed them to be voters, and for a few years in the South they were able to vote. But the whole story of Jim Crow South and the Ku Klux Klan and these very, very racist, violent groups that grew up in the South was very much about voter suppression. Even though technically the blacks had the right to vote, white people didn't want them to, and so they made it extremely complicated, if not dangerous, personally, to vote. That didn't get fixed technically until 1965. So I was 8 years old in 1965 when we had something called the Voting Rights Act, which made it the federal government's responsibility to police the states, to make sure the states were giving people, particularly black people, the right to vote. Even then, it was a fight to allow people to vote. Women only got the vote 100 years ago in this country, and not really black women, only white women. Asian Americans were restricted across the country in voting in many, many communities. So exclusion really was how it started, and we've been chipping away at exclusion and trying to make it inclusive for quite a while. But you know, the real issue, to be very, very blunt, is that this is about racism. This is about people who think that they are superior to other people, and that the people they're superior to aren't smart enough, aren't successful enough, aren't rich enough, aren't white enough, aren't male enough to be able to be given the vote. And that's the end of the story. They just don't want these people to vote. And unfortunately, you know, this is a sickness that's been with this country since its beginning. And I think this election season has showed us that it's something we still have a lot of work to solve, unfortunately.
I would like everyone to understand our voting history. Thank you for detailing it out now. I've been trying to understand the impacts of gerrymandering. It's not easy, but politicians can control outcomes by drawing up their own districts. Can you explain how gerrymandering has affected election results in some states? Can it be stopped?
Wow. We're covering all the important issues. So I know we're only doing this on voice, but those of you who are listening, I recommend go to Google Maps and look and type in Birmingham, Alabama, and look at the map that comes up. And what you will see is a city, Birmingham, Alabama, in the South, that's surrounded by this red line. This red line is the voting district, it's called the political map of Birmingham. And it is a mess. It's the city. You can look at the map and see there's a city, but the red line restricts certain areas of the city and effectively makes them outside of Birmingham, even though they're literally, you know, a mile from downtown. There's even a little part, if you follow that red line, that goes out into the western county about, I don't know, it looks like 10 miles away from Birmingham, that has become part of Birmingham because of gerrymandering. What happened in Birmingham, and it's happened all over the country, is that a lot of upper middle class and rich white families did not want to be politically attached to the poor black people of Alabama, and they elected officials who created this map to move them out. One of the reasons this happens, in addition to just blatant racism, is that in our country, we fund schools locally. Taxes on property. The property tax is what pays for schools. If you're living in a big, beautiful house, you're going to pay more taxes every year for schools than a person who lives in a tiny little apartment down the street. But your children and their children will have technically access to the same education. A lot of racists don't want that. They don't want to share their wealth with others. So they created these political boundaries that make it so they're outside of Birmingham. They're not part of Birmingham. Whatever Birmingham does is no longer their business. This story is the story of gerrymandering. In order to figure out how to control or get out of controlling a part of the country, a district, politicians created the maps, and the maps were there to segregate literally different populations from another. The way it works basically is, the United States is divided into 435 congressional districts, and each district elects a representative. In California, we have 53 representatives in Congress for our 40 million people. Okay, so that's the basics. That's what the Constitution says we should do. But it's up to the states to draw the map. So that map, it was for a long time, those maps were very political. If the Republicans were in charge of the state Congress, they could draw the map. If the Democrats were in charge, they could draw the map. What's happened lately, and California's just starting this, is that now we're making it so these maps are drawn by, again, nonpartisan or bipartisan groups. So it's not the people, not the party in power. The Democrats are running the show, they get to draw the map. No, it's a committee of citizens from all walks of life who draw these maps. And the idea is to make them fair, to make them balanced, to make sure that you're not just segregating people from each other to make your life better. You're trying to include everyone. It's going to take a long time to make this across the country, but more and more, what's really nice is that the Supreme Court and other courts are recognizing that this is just illegal. You can't do this gerrymandering stuff. You can't segregate like this. So we're slowly getting out of it. And it's actually, this election in particular is going to have some places, Michigan is one of them, North Carolina is another, where the maps have been redrawn. And it'll be interesting to see what the effect is.
Wow, that's interesting. I'm glad you were able to explain it for us. There are a number of people who say that voters should be required to have a reason for voting by mail. Otherwise, it will be too easy for people to cast fraudulent ballots. Can you talk to us about how important absentee voting is and how valid these claims may be?
Yeah, so let's start with the truth about election fraud is that it almost never happens. The number of votes that are cast illegally by whatever means are so small that they literally have impacted almost no election ever, certainly in modern times. So the idea that there's a way for elections to be fraudulent on a large scale is wrong. It's not true. It doesn't happen. And it particularly doesn't happen with absentee or vote at home. Two states, Colorado and Oregon, have been doing this for a long, long time. I think Oregon's been doing it since 2000. So 20 years of voting exclusively by mail. It's not even called an absentee ballot because but virtually nobody goes to a polling place to vote. They just vote at home. We know it works. We know that it's successful, that in fact, the other thing it does, which is interesting, and back to something we were talking about earlier, we found that when you make it easy for people to vote at home, more people will vote. You remember the barriers I talked about? It might be hard to get a babysitter to go to the polling. You're working that day. You can't get off. You've got the late shift. If you're voting at home, it doesn't matter when the election is. You can vote and mail in your ballot and be done a week, 2 weeks beforehand. So it's a really good way to get people to vote, and successfully. And in particular today, in this current climate, it's really important that we do have an excuse called the pandemic that is a reason why people shouldn't be standing in long lines and going into small church basements and, in school classrooms to vote. It's just not safe. It's not safe, particularly for, elderly and at-risk populations. So in a way, I think it's important to say that actually the pandemic is the perfect excuse for absentee voting. And hopefully, more and more states are allowing that to be the excuse to get the absentee ballot.
Well, I hope that everyone understands that and the consequences of not being able to use absentee voting.
Thanks.
The Electoral College has overruled the will of the people multiple times. Can you explain the origins, and does it still serve its purpose?
Yeah, well, it's back to that story of exclusion, not inclusion. We created the Electoral College because we were afraid of the popular vote. We weren't sure what that was going to actually do. Now, there's a certain reason for that. I mean, the colonies were formed from a country, England, that had some basics of democracy, but it was run, there were people who voted for certain things, but it was run by a king. It was, it was not a democracy by any stretch of the imagination. So I think the founders were a little concerned about what would happen if we gave the popular vote and just let everybody vote. So they created this second layer that is supposed to be sort of an insurance policy against the will of the people going the wrong way. It just doesn't work as intended. And frankly, those times are gone as far as I'm concerned. We shouldn't need an electoral college anymore. And I really wish we could, find the political will to get rid of it, because it's certainly changed 3 elections in my lifetime completely. And I don't think that's really healthy for democracy.
Well, it's pretty unbelievable that the Electoral College still stands. Something definitely needs to be done. How can interested listeners, first-time voters, and future voters support the U.S. Vote Foundation? People used to be able to research subjects and become informed when they vote, but now it is knowing what you want to believe in and finding information to confirm it.
So, well, first of all, I think that for young people, it's really good to do what you're doing, is to try to stay engaged, to try to be interested, to keep your eyes open and watch the world as the time approaches for you to be able to vote when you're 18. People can be politically active at any age. When I was a kid, we went door to door with my parents handing out leaflets and stuff. You can work on campaigns at any age. That's not a problem. So you can get involved that way. When you become 16, when you go to get your driver's license at the DMV, you can register to vote in the future when you get that driver's license. So you can say, I want my driver's license, and by the way, check this box. When I'm 18, I'm going to be a registered voter already. You can also at 16, and my daughter has applied for this, she's 16, you can be a poll worker. So you can actually go work in the polls on election day, helping people to vote. This is a particularly important thing for young people to do, because most of the people who work in polling places on elections are older than me, many of them. These are populations that are very much at risk for COVID-19, and they shouldn't be out doing that work. So having young people be in the polling places, taking on those jobs, would be wonderful. I think that, like I said, our motto is every citizen is a voter. And I think really at the end of the day, what makes us strong is people looking at their obligations as a citizen to be part of this political democracy that we have, and taking it very seriously. And again, even if you can't vote now, and unfortunately you're going to have to wait a few years as well, you can stay informed and be involved. We at U.S. Vote Foundation, actually, we have a couple of volunteers who are, one of them is a high school kid. He can't vote. He's one of our volunteers. He helps me with social media every day. He's a great guy, very smart, staying connected to the political environment. And obviously, you know, the other thing I encourage all young people to do is make sure that their parents, aunts and uncles, the people they know who are eligible to vote, make sure they're voting. You know, it's okay to nag them. You can tell them Josh sent you. Get them to vote.
I hope that many future voters listen to that. Well, it's been wonderful talking with you, Mr. Greenbaum. I learned so much, and I hope that my listeners have too. It's going to be a very critical election in U.S. history. My parents are fired up for this. I hope American voters realize the future is in all of their hands this year and discover the truth when voting. Please check out the U.S. Vote Foundation website. That's the end of A Change of the Chance, episode 8. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you in the next episode.